Of the local conference committee. Welcome to the second day of the 18th Art Society International Research Network Conference. When I woke up in the morning, I realized that it is the 18th anniversary, and I'm not sure about other countries, but in Poland, the 18th birthday is celebrated with great fanfare. So I would suggest to Phil to not forget about it tomorrow, while we have parallel beams to raise the dogs for the network congratulations. Today we have two plenary speakers, definitely a lot. The first one is Roch Wąsowicz. He's a lecturer in sociology at the University College London Social Research Institute and research associate at the Conflict and Civicness Research Group at London School of Economics and Political Sciences ideas. He graduated from the New School for Social Research in New York City and obtained his PhD from the London School of Economics and Political Science. The title of his talk is Art and Civicness, evaluating the social responses to the 2022 Ukrainian refugee emergency in Poland. We will follow as usual. You will have around 40 minutes for your talk, and then we will have 15 to 20 minutes in Q&As. Roch, the floor is yours.
Welcome.
Can you see the screen?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Can you hear me well enough? Okay, thank you. Good. Welcome everyone. It is my privilege and honor to be here to give this plenary address. Thank you for this kind introduction, Martin, and thank you for the invitation as well. It's a privilege to present insights from my ongoing research on the social responses to the 2022 Ukrainian refugee emergency that took place throughout Poland. I hope to show that what happened here last year disrupts our traditional notions of what is civil society or what it means to act civically. Because of the theme of the conference, I will use the example of an artistic space to illustrate that point. And then I'll elaborate on further empirical data and some limited theoretical arguments to bore you too much. There might be a little bit too much on the slides, but hopefully you'll find this informative. But I seem to be incapable of cutting down. The most important stuff is folded out. So the plan of the plenary is as follows. So I will first discuss how the 22 refugee relief in Poland was unique because of its magnitude and how it cut across society, and also how it ended up being deeply personal in the spirit of reflexivity. I'll my positionality as a researcher. I will then focus on analyzing the activities of the Sunflower Solidarity Community Center in Warsaw that is emblematic of the type of civic mobilization that took place in Poland in 2022. This will be followed by a bird's eye overview of the emergency that happened and the response that ensued. Subsequently, I will describe how refugee relief was delivered by diverse, adaptable, complementary, and ad hoc ecosystems rather than traditional civil society networks or institutions. In turn, this will allow me to flesh out my main argument, which is that bottom-up mobilization didn't come out of the blue or due to existential urgency only. Rather, that civicness observed last year was driven by dispositions and practices which have been developed in response to previous crises in Poland. Lastly, I will give examples of the past civic ecosystems, and I will show how they contributed to the 22 refugee relief. As I said before, it begs explaining just how much the social and the personal became intertwined after the 24th of February 2022. So the profoundness of war in Central Eastern Europe is almost cliche, and there's a lot of scholarly literature on how it is or is not constitutes socially transmitted PTSD. And for all of us here, in one way or another, connected to this history, and myself being a descendant of survivors of genocide, this all really ran true on a deeply emotional, existential level. But at the same time, what happened right after the first or 2 days of shock, what was brought about by this was an uncanny sense of purpose that cut across society by arguably to the greatest degree in terms of Zemelian social effervescence since 1989. That something was happening, definitely even bigger than Poland's accession to the European Union, which for me personally was also a formative experience as a teenager. Because when it started happening, we were all anticipating a humanitarian crisis in Poland. But it never happened. But because we were anticipating it, many people, and I'll show this, became personally involved to stop it. And this is also where I outline and signal my personality in this. So I was actually abroad when it started happening, but then I came back to Poland and I was helping out. I wasn't helping out as much as some people were, but in that sense, this my distance from the subject matter is limited, and I thought it's best to address this. But at the same time, it also allowed me to being in Warsaw, being in Krakow, going to Ukraine as well with humanitarian aid, allowed me to experience something that was palpable, which was also the role of culture in expressing the zeitgeist of what was happening. And I'll go straight into this right now, just to equip you also in terms of the subject matter that is safety or contents. So we could begin with the evaluation of the social response to the refugee emergency by focusing on the micro-case study that comes from the Arts domain. And it is the Sunflower Solidarity Community Center, in Polish, the acronym SDK, and I'm using the password. It was set up immediately on the 24th of February 2022 by activists, by artists, by curators, by engaged citizens, by academics. But also by regular volunteers. And it found vessel at the Modern Art Museum in Warsaw and in Warszawa, which is a bit of an ephemeral institution. It doesn't even have a permanent building yet. The building is being built. It's been built since 1989, so we're going to dive into this reconstruction of the self-image of Poland since the end of communist style authoritarian communism. But it is known for its many activist interventions. It's known for being cutting edge, even though it doesn't have a tremendous arsenal of artworks like MoMA or Tate, or even things that are comparable in other Central European capitals, for that matter. But what is special about the Sunflower Solidarity Community Center is that, like all humanitarian initiatives established in February 2022, it focused on immediate material relief. But what followed were activities, very shortly, aimed at the cultural affirmation of Ukrainian sovereignty, which was being and is still being eradicated by Russia's imperial neo-colonialist invasion. Very early in the conflict, what people from the SK articulated was that they realized that something that had been affirmed by the Russian dictator himself in his infamous essay from 2021 on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians, quote unquote, is that the goal of what used to be the special military operation was the erasure of Ukrainian culture and its language. Consequently, preservation, affirmation, and celebration of Ukrainian culture, history, and its language by the growing diaspora became an integral part of the relief effort at the SDK and other similar cultural and artistic institutions, or rather practices, specifically that I will argue throughout, that was present. But it's also about the inclusion of refugees in that effort. Just pointing to the significance of culture to Ukrainian sovereignty, there's some reference from the literature from the region. Just if anyone's interested in this, I can just follow up. So a little bit about the community center itself. This is the facade in one of its temporary places. Some of the tech visual reference here, which will become clear in a minute. Particularly the significance of the sunflower, which for many of you might be evident. But Soняшник in Ukrainian is culturally emblematic. It's a popular crop in Ukraine from the New World, from the Americas. And until today, actually, Ukraine is one of the largest producers of sunflower oil. Followed this debates on the grain transports, particularly to Africa and Southeast Asia and South Asia. sunflower oil was also a big part of this. But it's also been a symbol of peace in Ukraine. It's been a symbol of peace since 1986, when after the Chernobyl disaster, sunflowers were planted for environmental reasons to purify the soil, but also became so it's actually here indicative. Was also became part of the Ukrainian renewed self-determination efforts against Soviet communism. And in 1996, when Ukraine relinquished its nuclear weapons to Russia, the sunflowers started wearing the ceremony. And very poignantly, on the 24th of February 2022, something that's been virally transmitted through popularized through online, YouTube and elsewhere, was a clip of a Ukrainian woman from the Kherson region interrogating a Russian soldier what he came to their land and giving him sunflower seeds and urging him to put them in his pockets so that the flowers would grow when he died on his land. So you can believe multifaceted symbolism of this. So hence, apart from the direct aid responsive to the needs of the Ukrainians in Poland and back home, language, education quickly became an important pillar of the activities of the SDK. So teaching Ukrainians Polish and also teaching Polish Ukrainian. As did the showcasing of Ukrainian arts, culture, and inclusion of Ukrainian artists and cultural workers into the Polish public sphere, but also information warfare, particularly against Russian propaganda and Western orientalization of Central Eastern Europe in general and Ukraine in particular. This found its manifestation in the Sonyak Digest, a somewhat short-lived publication that was established when its idea was born when the resonance of truth about the war in the West had been far from certain. In time, the activities of the SDK went beyond mere celebration of Ukrainianness and integration within the Polish society, but they opened their doors to other regime dissidents from Belarus, which is a very contentious issue in the Ukrainian diaspora, and they also supported controversial social and cultural causes in Poland, which pride, such pride, so rather controversial in Poland, although it's growing year on year. What is important about SDK is that it's emblematic of the type of civicness that began, that took place in 22. It was diverse, it comprises artists, curators, but also volunteers, regular people. It was at first informal and only then found in institutional vessel, became supported by the ministry, by the museum, no ministries were involved. And then the city. It was also interdependent within the Warsaw ecosystem of help from February 2022 and complementary to the wider refugee relief. So before I elaborate on all of what all of this means in terms of our conceptual understandings of civil society, I would like to briefly sketch out the macro context in which all of this is taking place. Many of you are obviously familiar with this, but the numbers that actually here pertain to 22 alone are really indicative of the magnitude of the challenge that is happening and the response. So the conservative estimates of the migration unit of Warsaw University, very conservative estimates based on multifaceted data, is that at one point or another, 8 million people passed through Poland's territory last year. That is one-fourth of the original population, and received some sort of help. 3/4 of Poles surveyed admitted to help them, whether they did or not. You know how Poland works, but it's still a huge number in a country of supposedly low social trust. The official numbers by the Ministry of Interior, by the PESEL, the Personal Identification Number Scheme, puts the number of Ukrainian refugees in residence since February 24th at 1.4 million. And their status has been legalized under the EU Temporary Protection Directive, which is the first of that kind, and it's rather special in the sense that it gives Ukrainian refugees full access to the labor market and the welfare system, which is remarkable in comparison to other refugee protection statuses. In particular, Ukrainian refugees are free to come and go from Poland within the EU and also in and out of Ukraine. In combination with the previous migration cohorts that started coming here since the early 90s, but really picked up speed after the Euromaidan in 2014, the population of Ukrainians in Poland right now, very conservatively, we put it 2.3 million, 2.1 to 2.3 million, which is 6% of the current population. And what I wanted to point out here as well, out of many data that have been brought here, is the type of benefits that in some regard can be perceived as modest, but on the other hand, have been fairly ubiquitous. So 50% of war refugees without prior migration experience, and 39% of those who were returnees to Poland received some kind of welfare provisions from the state. This could have been a very modest one-time payment of 300 zlotys, or the 1,200 zlotys support provided for their hosts. But what is more actually indicative here of the type of migration and type of provision that's been offered is the 500 monthly stipend for each dependent under the age of 18, and 400,000 plus dependents have been receiving it without any criteria added on. So this equality of economic and social rights for refugees in Poland is fairly unprecedented. And by September 22, Poland spent $1 billion on this. So what we witnessed, and what is corroborated by various sources that are obviously mentioned in this presentation, is that in the first hours, days, or even weeks of the war, humanitarian assistance was a quintessentially grassroots effort, delivered by a hitherto unseen constellation of factors. The state, international humanitarian organizations joined in the effort only gradually. And housing provision is very indicative of the bottom-up dimension of health, which was already indicated in the previous slide. Overwhelmingly, 60 to 80% of the refugees were housed in private accommodations. And reception centers that operated last year were, for the most part, staffed by volunteers, even though they ended up being state funded. Also, looking at the numbers, private funding for refugee relief was a tenfold of the benefit of the welfare provision provided by the state. And ultimately, as calculated by the Polish Economic Institute, a third of all expenses for the refugee provision was footed by private individuals. Another important observation is that it wasn't just traditional civil society, institutionalized civil society that acted, but it was different constellations of actors coming together in a fairly ad hoc manner, as it is in moments of emergency. And it was especially true in the early hours and days of the attack. And even in the long run, as particularly an example from Krakow by Beczerská Szkoła's research indicates, ecosystems of help were very informal, and the relationships that drove them were not institutionalized. Even when the state and international organizations appeared, it was still driven by the relationships that were established in the first days, hours and days of the conflict. These insights from empirical research resonate with our contemporary conceptualization when it comes to the evolution of civil society. This is where I tackle slightly some theory with me. Calder and Radis been thinking about Mary Calder has worked on civicness and conflict for many years now, and her writing on this is most recent writing on this points shows the evolution from our the institutional understanding of civil society or Putnamian networks, clubs, bowling alone, sort of neoliberal or American style society to a more activist civil society that was especially prevalent in Central Eastern Europe and contributed to the fall down of dismantling of the style authoritarian communism following to gradually to evolution of understanding of civicness rather than civil society institutions or networks. So the actual acts. And here I quote the small and particular ways by people acting as civic modes of citizenship and public authority existed. And these insights come from research, particularly in conflict zone in Syria and Sudan, in Bosnia and elsewhere. But as Calder has argued, it is also applicable to Ukraine. To say that explicitly. So it's the importance of actions, motivations, and outcomes rather than the networks and the institutions that exist. This brings me to the discussion of how these civic practices were actually organized and how it is most expedient to categorize them. And again, I relied on the review of some research from the fields that Colin Dunn and Kaliszewska carried out ethnographic research on the Polish-Ukrainian border, throughout which they found that civic practices were constitutive of social trust rather than existing structures or networks. And as mentioned before, Mtakov, Chevska and colleagues identified that local activists cooperated with local civil rights activists cooperated with neighborhood campaigners, but also businesses for the first time. They were the ones in the front line. They were the ones who responded to the emergency first, and later local government, or rather the voivod, which is the intermediary between the central government and the local government, stepped in. Big NGOs, big international organizations, they were the ones who came in later. And that's why what's useful to a useful way of analyzing this conceptual notion put forward by Evangelos Matheras of civic ecosystem, which stipulates that this form of social organization in response to crisis of human security that is diverse, informal, complementary, self-organizing, interdependent, and adaptable. And I will be using these terms to analyze the forms of refugee relief that happened in Poland last year. My original argument in all of this, if you're wondering, is that this autumn of civicness didn't come out of the blue. It's that the past civic ecosystems that existed in Poland, that they had laid out the foundation for the civicness that was deployed in 2022. So that previous periods of civic mobilizations have been laboratories of action where people developed skills and dispositions to act civically. And they were always in response to crises of human security, either in the domain of the built or natural environment, or in terms of civil rights. And I will discuss in detail what they were and how they laid a foundation for the dispositions and skills that were redeployed in 2022. So these are just but a few past notable civic ecosystems, but they were really indicative of the, as I said, either the failures of the state to address crises of human security, or rather almost rogue policies of the state against civil rights. So on the one hand, there's extensive literature on the significance of local neighborhood or urban movements in Poland that have tackled and really pushed the dial on environmental issues. They have now had more successes in terms of legislation because of where the public conversation has moved on the climate emergency. But when they started appearing in the 90s and when they started formalizing also in the 2010s, they were really fringe and really fighting an uphill battle. But they were the net, again, I don't want to use the word networks, so it comes to my mind immediately, but they were this ecosystem that were locally organized, people coming together to address poor air quality or lack of green spaces in cities in quintessentially bottom-up fashion that in time managed to actually change the legislation, but also created these engaged or developed engaged citizens throughout. And this is, with all its discontents and shortcomings, a success story in Poland. On the other hand, there are quite a few uphill battles in the civil rights domain that have been waged in Poland since 1989. Most notably, as you're probably aware, the women's rights struggle against for the freedom of choice. That's been happening since 1993, if I'm not mistaken. But most recently, the 22 almost complete ban on freedom of choice or abortions in Poland resulted in huge social upheaval for a few weeks after the political decision had been made to restrict the right of women to obtain abortions in Poland, even more so than it had been before. But that was sprouted from this, with a myriad of clandestine initiatives to assist women in Poland to carry out pharmacological abortions and, if necessary, to travel abroad to, in many instances, to save their lives, either to the Czech Republic, to Slovakia, to Germany, or Holland, and also the United Kingdom. But those ecosystems, also operating very much locally, as I will elaborate in a minute, were another iteration of this kind of practice of citizens. Equally, the prices of equality for LGBT plus people, Poland rates is the least, is the worst country in the European Union for formal equality of LGBT plus people. Although the reality, the social reality and the political reality are two different things. And we don't have time to get into this. But LGBT plus people, queer people have been used as were used as a scapegoat in the 2018, 2019, and 22 electoral cycles in Poland, and really contributed to the bottom-up mobilization throughout Poland. Pride, I think, is happening right now in more than 24 cities in Poland, which is rather unprecedented. You see the one in Krakow or Warsaw is big and resembles everything you see, from the West. But this local organizational effort for LGBT equality is also unprecedented, although it is a losing game for now. At the same time, another important path to the ecosystem that can be traced in the ecosystems of help towards refugees from 2022 that I analyzed is Ukrainians that live in Poland for, as I said, there's been a historical Ukrainian minority since the Second World War, Poland's colonial legacy towards Ukraine. That's a whole other discussion. But really since 2014, Ukrainians have mobilized politically in Poland for the sake of democracy at home. Some claim that they've been sending not only material but also democratic remittances. But really, Ukrainians had existed in Poland until 2014 as an invisible labor migration, and really began to build their political, social, and cultural standing in the Polish public sphere since 2014. And this organizational effort also built skills and dispositions that were very quickly deployed by the diaspora, together with the Polish counterparts in those ecosystems of health from the 24th of February 2022. And the last ecosystem that I identified that mattered for the 22 refugee relief was the ongoing Belarusian migrant border crisis, which isn't as well known. It's you know of it. So there was a bit of proxy war happening on the Belarusian border, instigated by the Belarusian dictator Alexander Lukashenko, which resulted in a profound crisis of human security, whereby refugees are stranded on the Polish-Belarusian border, pushed from one side by the Belarusian border force across the European Union, and then stopped and pushed back by the Polish border force against all humanitarian conventions. And they are being helped. They're being helped by activists. They're being helped by people on the ground, by doctors, by volunteers from the local community throughout Poland. People who are in the eyes of the Polish law committing crimes by helping those undocumented migrants. So this evidence of past civic ecosystem engagement has been found among actors delivering refugee relief in 2022. In particular, in Kraków, people who have been involved in urban neighborhood associations in the past or campaigns for civil rights were joined by a plethora of entrepreneurs and businesses for the first time. This is particularly important. The ethnographic research in Kraków revealed that people who started acting on the first day of war came from what they themselves described as underground spaces. So people had been active in myriad of civil rights causes and practicing what they thought of was civil disobedience, including anarchists. So it's rather magnificent that anarchists at some point organized in Poland in order to deliver refugee relief. And neighborhood spaces, so people who, in their own perception, were non-political and were only concerned by their own surroundings and building the community around everyday issues that cut across political lines. They were the ones who also set it up. And unexpectedly, researchers identified robust business spaces. So people with individuals with high economic capital who for the first time became civically engaged in Poland. Again, there's a huge difference between, particularly the United States of America, where in kind of philanthropy, giving back, however you want to call it, has not been popular in Poland because of its particular transition in market economy and demand. And these civic ecosystems, I will discuss them very briefly because we don't have time for this, but we take a closer look at the local ecosystems of health that emerged in 22. It's confirmed that people who have been active civically in the past were the ones who were overrepresented among the first responders. They weren't the only ones. There were many people for whom this is the first time that they became politically, civically active, but there was enough people in those ecosystems of health who had been active before, and they came from largely from those ecosystems that I just discussed, but not only. Now, oftentimes their efforts were supported or even replaced by local, state, or international help. In time. Yet many of them played an instrumental role throughout 2022, and this is also confirmed by research that those informal ad hoc connections that were made initially, particularly WhatsApp channels, Facebook groups, this really was the driving force of the refugee wave throughout. And just to give you a bit of a snippet of how it's operated in some of the bigger hubs and then smaller hubs of refugee relief. So in Warsaw, in particular, volunteers organized themselves coming from this local neighborhood. People who have been involved in those urban movements and they started counting heads and see how many people they could help. And it was only the city that then took, they didn't even take over the effort, but then provided frameworks in order to streamline this and then for this help to be better deployed. But this sequence from neighborhood local activists to the city taking over or joining the effort is very evident in Warsaw. Was very evident in Warsaw, which then established a whole coordination support center, etc. In Krakow, on the other hand, it was not so much particular people coming together, but groups that existed before from those underground or neighborhood spaces that then were joined by the really supported at some point by the Voivod, which is interesting that a city in Krakow, in comparison, its activities in that regard pale in comparison to other cities in Poland, it was either actually the emissary of the state of the central government that really streamlined those efforts down the line and helped to make it more efficient, although that's obviously debatable. In Lublin, a city of about 300,000, I think so, more or less, a frontline city on the Ukrainian border. This has been the migrant-focused activists, the ones that have been active on the Belarusian border, the one that have been defying the Polish state in providing refugee relief for regular migrants since 2021. That built an ad hoc coalition that then became the Lublin Social Committee for aid to Ukraine, that then became supported by the official city. What is very interesting as well is that in smaller towns below 100,000, and I'm going to just read them out because they're very beautiful Polish names. Stawens, Piotrków, Konin, Przemyśl, Ostrowiec Świętokrzyski, Wodzisław Śląski, Rybnik i Ława. It's a mouthful, I know. There is evidence that in those medium-sized cities, it were the women's ecosystem that formed in 2022 became nascent places of or spaces where refugee relief was first organized. And very interestingly, activists in the All Poland Women's Strike, both men and female, regardless of gender, rather, came together, got to know some of the people they ended up collaborating with in 2022 and 2020. But in 2020, they were on the opposite side of the ideological boundary, especially police or local government who were enforcing the abortion ban law or keeping order when protests were happening. But in 2022, those past civic ecosystems were redeployed even across political and ideological lines. Another much deeper, this is I'm running out of time, but it is my second to last slide, is that there was also an unprecedented assistance for businesses on both local and national level, and even some controversial multinational corporations stepped up and provided assistance that was unprecedented. Obviously, there are many considerations to be taken in place here to account why did it here, why did it do it elsewhere, but it is a matter of fact what we did here. And also what we're actually currently studying is the engagement of local or entrepreneurs and businesses who for the first time decided to give back to the community. Okay, now I'm just concluding. So, my overall argument is that bottom-up civicness, that bottom-up civic mobilization prevented a humanitarian crisis in Poland from erupting in 2022. That is not extremely controversial, but the initial relief efforts, I argue, were provided by those self-organized ecosystems of help. and many people who comprised them had been civically active before, especially at the local level or in the civil rights movement. At the same time, the engagement with businesses was a new phenomenon, and that, as I said, rendered it further study. Ultimately, the practice of filling in for the state in the past, or fighting best practices, has equipped society with skills and dispositions to act civically that were redeployed in 2022. Ultimately, I argued and I hoped to show that responding to the crisis is a formative civic experience, which can be redeployed in the future. Thank you.
Thank you all for this fascinating findings of your very recent research. We've got 15 minutes to ask questions, make comments.
Thank you for your presentation. If you could talk a little bit more about what happened when larger organizations stepped in, what happened to public and civic engagement in that movement.
Sure. So interestingly enough, a lot of it carried on. Obviously, I focused my research on 2022, because be able to grasp this, and when we can see that the wave of the refugee flow of refugees really peaks at about April and May, and then it stabilizes, and now we're in this interesting ebb and flow of people existing in this transnational space between Poland and Ukraine. Legally, I think the temporary protection for refugees expires the 23rd of August of this year. But again, from what we found is interesting that after, at least in the first few months after the state and international organizations have joined local volunteers and those initially systems of help still carried on, and particularly because and there was a lot of friction between them, right? Especially the state thought it knew how to provide refugee relief, and a lot of international organizations came to Poland and they're supposed to only patterns, introduce rules and regulations known from other civil conflict contexts. An anecdote I can bring here of what the organization said. A friend of mine worked for a humanitarian organization in London, and he's Polish, and nobody else in the office, and they were Ukrainians in Poland before the war. And he was the only person sent to Poland where it made it work. So obviously we have to rely on the systems that existed before.
Thank you very much. My understanding is that this is usually a very positive response as the first phase. Is there a second phase type of response, integration and expectation and sense making around that?
I don't think that those new systems have the capacity to endure for that long. Most of them, at least, they are in response to the crisis of human security, and they be able to make this space. Most of them. So, for example, I know the Sunflower Center is scheduled to close by the end of the year because the funding runs out. But my expectation is that it will actually carry on because it can focus really difficult to a different type of agenda. Interestingly enough, Mr. Poland came out the other day, and the acceptance of Ukrainian migrants and refugees in Poland is very stable. I think it dropped in terms of social supply to the system, merely a few percent. So this relief fatigue or exhaustion, even xenophobic sentiments that are peddled by almost everyone in this series of upcoming election. It's really affecting the integration of Ukrainian migrants so far. But see what the future brings. But as I said, some of them may last, but most of them will dissipate. But my further argument would be that these dispositions of health and skills may be reignited and redeployed in other systems and boards and particularly with medical physicians and they are otherwise. If you don't find it useful, you tell me more.
I think there was one over there.
Mentioned genocide, and as I was stating your presentation, I couldn't help asking, are there any examples that you draw from where communities in this country came together in terms of solidarity?
During the Holocaust, you mean, or after? Okay. Okay. So this is a topic for the conversation. I think what happened in Poland last year is remarkable, particularly because this kind of solidarity that goes beyond ethnic lines. And I know that from the Western perspective, there's a lot of commentary that the media, there's white people helping white people, whereas there's a legacy of ethnic groups on both sides. There's a history of pluralism, bipolarism, Ukrainians. There's a history of genocide, the Cold War. The other side, so there, and actually these conflicts were very much used in culture and politics. The nations and society against one another. It's very recent. The presidents of Poland and Ukraine were no friends. So it's interesting. I don't really know because I think when you go back to the Holocaust, the Polish official narrative is that Poles helped. Were the most helpful ones, which is not true. Many people are against things of how many people were asked to stand by, passive do and were complicit. So in that sense, I mean, time will show, but after more than a year, it is remarkable in the historical long array that it's not just that somehow society managed to express the ethno-national idea of what we should help finish with. Right? There is something remarkable about this. And I know that probably calls them much less into there isn't a public sentiments towards other groups. But I think it's interesting to see this as an incubator of something that could be a positive example for the future.
Yes, I'm Philip Delanzisco, Congo Research Networks, also New School alum. My question was not really a question, but it is a question, is you kind of told a bittersweet story, and it's bitter in the sense of what you said in one line, which is such a unique response to refugee crisis. We've seen so many cases, both current and past, not such a welcoming, and I'm not talking about the Polish context, but in a more broader sense. I was wondering what you thought about how it would change refugee politics in general. You know, is this a unicorn because of these kind of contexts that you talk about, or is there something that the world can really learn about how we treat refugees.
Very honest. I think we're seeing how this might resonate within Polish society, just to keep it on this meso scale, I suppose, because of the election. And unfortunately, we're seeing that xenophobic sentiments against particularly labor migrants, legal labor migrants coming from Muslim countries is being used as a political tactic. How much that resonates in society, we'll see in the election. Is not very representative, because if you ask someone, are you skeptical of someone coming from a different culture to their country? Well, you will be yes. I mean, there are outliers. UK is interesting in that regard. Because of Brexit or after Brexit, polling seems to indicate that the UK is very much open to foreigners, and it's interesting, yeah. And again, it's Poland, right? So we don't know what it really is. But I think we'll see in October, we think whether or not this narrative in the political cycle pays off. And how people will vote, and whether or not this will stay as a topic of conversation. And then we might say, well, this is just one-off, or people have realized that solidarity extends even beyond. But it is interesting to follow up on that point that Poland came from an extremely homogenous country, one of the most homogenous countries in the world, to one of the super hyper diverse yet. And it's the we have this super less ish super for Poland. As bringing in over 100,000 migrants, labor migrants from outside of Europe every year since 2014. So this is a very conservative government that peddles many xenophobic campaigns. It's actually bringing in migrants because it was politically and economically feasible. And there hasn't been a backlash until now, and it was only politically made, really. So. Yeah.
Thank you.
I think we can find the one comment. You don't allow me to ask this question because I'm South African now. Nervous to ask this question. You don't get that problem. 2 flights that landed in Warsaw very recently. So of course we read the South African news on how it was received and experienced here. And perhaps something of the, from your perspective, is the experience on the other side, you know.
I'm a proud alumnus of the Cape Town edition of the Musicals Democracy University Seminar. I spent quite a bit of time in South Africa, including when the war started. I was in Cape Town, so I've actually been following this public debate from both sides. I come to my South African, but I think how immigration and politics plays a role in South Africa in the local sub-Saharan context. So I think in terms of when you look at the track record of both administrations, the Polish government and the South African government, they're, I would say, almost equally complicit in one way or another. My informed guess would be that it had to do more with mismanagement on both sides, and nothing that would deliberately jeopardize the peace process. Because if there's one thing that this government is trying to be good at, is the Ukrainian war, the war of Ukraine, I think. So if going back to xenophobia or perception, I think xenophobia definitely has played a role. Although I would be cautious of
very delicate argument of necessarily replicating Western understandings of racial reckoning dynamics to essentially European context. I think a lot of it is being replicated through popular culture, et cetera. I mean, I think Islamophobia is very much Western import into Poland, but it is something I discussed with my students a lot as well. I think we all kind of suffer a little bit from this American hegemony of thinking about race relations, and I think the difference. So I think if we look at it from a more local context, I think we'll get a little bit more nuance. But ultimately, I think that Ramaphosa just got too much guns because he likes guns, and too many armed personnel, and the Poles were freaked out and didn't know what to do because we're a country right now in the war, and there's rules and regulations and red tape is slapped in Poland. And yes, they were Africans, so they didn't think they mattered as much as it's something the West. So I think this is but I don't think it was still necessarily. This is my very subjective. But I think in this follows, I think there are many parallels in Poland and South Africa in terms of democratization and structurally also. So these two cases, uncanny relationship between the two in many ways.
Great, fantastic. Thank you very much. We can- Our next speaker will be Dr. Michał Moraty. He's a social anthropologist. He teaches at the University of Roehampton, London, United Kingdom. But he obtained his PhD from the Jagiellonian University, so welcome back home. Michał is also a novelist. His last book was awarded best historical book of the year in Poland. Currently, he is in charge of a big research project on racism and far right in everyday life. I suspect that he's going to take us for a walk in the woods.
Very much.
Okay, it's off, yeah.
Thank you very much, everyone. My father, my boss, straight away. I'll thank for an intense conferencing also. Thank you, Lily, and that. Hello, everyone. My name is Michał, and first of all, big thanks for inviting me here and being here and matching asked me to do this thing. I was like, arts. My relationship with arts is complicated. My wife is an artist. I managed to stay away with social research wise. I did many other things. But it was, I teach a lot of my students urban studies and London and the arts and features there, of course. Invited here, I thought, why not invite you for a walk on around how anthropologists can contribute to certain way of thinking about art and maybe away from standard discussion around art, with the synoptics, but also the aesthetics for communication studies and all these things. So I'll try to do that. I will mostly concrete, so I'll show you some of my examples and which it illustrates this and also contextualize it. I think it was in Poland and Krakow, of course. So I'm allowed to say. So this is good news. And I went to be in San Diego last month in the digital conference at University of San Diego, and when we talked, well, call for the book, published in 2010, second edition in 2015, and they talk about third edition. It's pretty quick, but it was niche in 2010, and they always say that we had published failures, and now it's like, we demand. What do you see on when you see and hear and observe a distant rise of far right environment sales and very important movement in one model. Rule designated head groups, smoothing groups, violent students, white terrorist groups in the US, and they will find out about discuss the states and obviously name. We want to keynote there in the talk and use kind of not surprised, but also what else? Found to treat far right seriously medicine as a clinical study, other than environment study. So instead of reading financial times, the Guardian or the BBC times, and then again, opinion. So we really began to look what these are the why you do why you feel that way. I was very multiple dimensions of all this. This is not just the eyes, it's very complex. I'm not going to get into that thing. But nevertheless, we have to be honest again. We don't have it. This is the moment, professional cost with legitimizing use, and you're around with guys in a band. Whatever you might say about these individuals going to the Alexander David division, the Russian civilization, the neo-fascist Russian imperialists. Unifying people thinking alike. My anyone or company then the it's not coming sooner or later. It was just a question of someone particularly like someone having a media powerful concern actually to discourse ideas to action by the same economics, but different in that sense, but I how do you embed to some extent or less? This is the reason for this overview one. So what is open from the book, but we know that the far right party is in the bottom. Individually related to 18, 17. Well, you also see use by the way that it's also on the rise. Virus extremist ideologies. We want to come into version the party rights. I would say also partially maybe off because it expresses mainstreaming of the far. If you listen to the government these days, they talk Bahraini language. It's exactly what I wanted. And so I would say it's for the most part. Yes, but earlier. Violence. The link between the groups and historically, history and this is the strong relation between farming, farmer students, and now. Let's have, aside from all the stories about living in school and also in Vienna and reading support, but it's was used to in Nazi ideology and the exhibition of the art of it. It famous for and the exhibition in 1937 in Munich, where the brothers and others works of Constantine Lees, the previous candidates were exhibited as an example of non-German degenerate art, which should be destroyed, should be regarded as morally corrupt, alien, spirit, many people with talents, Germany. There was occasionally coupled with the original book burning. Yes, of course. Book burning has a particularly emotional measure. I think we all open books and or the write books and your books on this special fund. And the figure of the involved in the creation of all why there's great lengths to destroy things that someone may there's a huge amount of emotion that people plan to find and fix it. They should know if they are being asked, what is actually the function of art and Nazi machine or and an example would be this, so nationalistic the exhibition was for people were able to get is that it was parallel with the German art exhibition also in Munich, so it was now clear process. And we noticed that the Nazi art or far right art with architecture, it's incredible works. You might not have it, but gosh, this is really excellent. It's imperial, it's grand, It's obviously, it looks like a temple, but it's a museum. And anyone who knows how Duncan works on civilized rituals, a circle approach on art galleries and museums, and the big sound the newspapers looking for our schools, the seminars, they are informed, doing things and things. So that I'll hold them terrible inside as it might be, but we are simply sometimes in order to the flower behind. It's still combined with this. Yeah, I think the second point is to get these two go find that. What my view and your answer is point at the creation of new to the race and anyone been brought in for the inaugural, something like the books notes very often is that, well, she's fascinated with that. In Southern states, and people who interviewed, very often use the same issues. There's some sort of stickiness of certain ideas that we use. And whoever they are, whether they label, whether the media communication, they very often use the same tropes, symbols, ideas. And I did wrote this one, that is Mario saying, racist guy, I would say, very low racist approach, and implicit civilizations discourse behind this, position the West as superior, you like it or not. And his book is what it was bestseller for a while. It was New York Times Festival. We write about it more about the inheritance. I think with that very often the decision about ours around us, decay of the arms, nothing, and what happens with that always happen, nice, nothing. Really. Well, then, obviously, our controls. Conceptualize art as no so art as a I think about we have on this kind of dense combination of deep wasted matters, power, singular incentives. Rather than make sense of create the hero and the people without. I think we're going to start with now to start with decisions and tables and something about what that's the people actually. What is going on there? We should rethink are less in terms of. Networks. I think this person are keeping this. They are really don't like that. And the issue like this, it's still really very simple. And then obviously, on your side, the symbol in the full communication. And I think this was inspired by what is the colonial obsession with non-Western side of art, they use there. And then how they start to think about, let's say, Irish sort of non-entity difficult thing. And let's say they start to think about how through that Irish bit to think about the body around us. Obviously, I can't. That's good. I was going to show you a quote from obviously a classic. So is there a quote
You're supposed to show that.
Yeah.
Oh, so the one before.
In fact, just to put we're not going to think about art as time, as communication, as a tool of propaganda, etc. And I think this title falls and colonialism and it's racism for this work. I think we can still draw some inspiration. In particular with this guy, the kids, of course, who wrote extensively about art. I'm sorry to have a long quotes, but his style and language is, of course, preserved. But it's a little bit more beyond the version of somebody with education. And it's not about the new crew. The leader we need. So we have to then need the things that we love to land. So connecting it's total land, festival walks, trying to ghost, trying to be in knowledge commercials. Experience or street art can once again use to locate the power of the simply sources of this spell. Like the style of this the long sentences. Essentially, I think it was in the Vice House, we intended to step back and start thinking about something about what the curious and the war refers to the privacy to the passage about the paragraphs, where it says that other line, the form of lines, and so forth on. But then more than attached there, you can just probably something like the notion one isolates and make it simple. It's not a distinctive sensibility to the whole life. One in which you face the stars that you leave on them. Oracle, I think, especially the stars of Calvin is very important. I'm going to do quickly. The functions perspective on and it's not but really about looking at how the fueling functions so it's not to be so, and only explained by explains what about functions it states that what about the elaborate mechanisms of binding social relationships, sustaining the rules, sustaining the plans. Well, function is nothing very measurable having views about this stops creating this stuff. You want to be there and boring will be less beautiful, but it might really change. I think okay, this is very ground here in my book, but what I really want to draw your attention to when you listen to Guy Perkins Jordan in 1998, Albert Gell, which my colleagues wrote this, and if you don't know this, I mean, it's worth it's essentially built radical tries to move away from aesthetics, from philosophy of art and semiotics. He invites us to think about art and its function. Trying to figure out object of art as a non-human person, as opposed to the nation, with its own power. Imagination, we have the ability to create this model of goosebumps when you're back, expressing your emotions. And it's depending on the agility of and you can change it. You can move it stuff, but you can change it. You can flip rather than social change or anything like that. Make sure diet. To state the boundaries, but it's not a big passive. And then because they have their own dynamic, because of the rules, they have their own. Think about how much so There's nothing else I say. No, essentially states that there is something in the fact that artists usually are pretty secretive about the methods, about the craft, about the kind of things they use, how they make the things they use. The work of Renaissance painters of Renaissance Italy, good visual effect was a very, very important commercial thing. Was a vital information, secretly held. The line is about defense, secret police, statements of the KGB, and the craftsman of Moranblas, Moranblas, possessed this unique knowledge about how to do that. And they sort of asked for the fame and the level, so they couldn't leave the Republic. Some of them couldn't stay because they were totally happy with the Medici, Florence, but then similar to those communication, literally, the finishing the public police, rather than the end of those technology also made, not from this world. So I can witness to liminal states. And this is very important because it's not sometimes comes alive. Let's think about the early illusionist paintings and where or in countries where some really like making the images wanted to and sometimes usually or the arts, the kind of art which in this institution of impressions, they have many Spanish, with Italian naturalistic tradition of lovers. So sculptures evoke sufficient really great emotions, hate, love, fear. So clearly about the better. The basic man to go back planet Earth and to talk a little bit about a story that apologies my Polish colleagues and they understood well. Maybe think about it in a slightly different way. The story of an art exhibition in 2020 by Italians, controversial installation artists. But how the state from the state hundreds this and there was an installation which it's the towns was signed probably spectrum far right and the ideas of what it is. Well, basically, it's a niche product that's it's not so now my types of coverage and then two MPs big things on the hands Now it's, they didn't probably you have the need of it. In the process, sculpture of all damage was except that the insurer basically looking at this law and this wasn't actually well done. And it was a kind of example, and the petition to remove the plant, and then actually to remove to retire. So this whole debate turned very nasty and specific discourse around arts and religion. So, I mean, more about the vision when I look at the pictures, you have to know the story to realize that it's actually these guys are not performing, they are real people who want to interact with that. Okay, because you look as how the exhibition, you look at how the exhibition. Possible 22 years. The galleries have a different management. This is state money was institution. Obviously, taxpayers' money, political discourse around this, and we have to decide to do this. Usually, I know if you look at the word, it's called the law, which is full. And, it's not there anymore. It's outside the gallery, and it's photographs. So the pool of water there is now a pool. It's red paint, and the pole that you see the photo of the pole with this was yes, it's probably the local knowledge around Starboard. Also, used to down that the local knowledge about also it's also the vision of the resources and how they will out, which is for the money and control. We have a different there is something else then so this time being out for him and for others, they also then also control them. The products and available is good and red and green and then this was this willingness or and perhaps it's the reason powerful. Please tell about I was going to say what is treated as a person, a living thing. It happens with religious and humans or artists and viewers, they need them to control what you have. Creation in arts, and here I think we have something similar, which is not similar to the book burning, but it's similar to people interacting with art in a violent way, creating something which is new, but also with its own revelation. And we see the views of complexity or now existing politics. This is it's agency. I would say he has he was the one who's been around the safe programs, which had he was able to be and art in that area of statement the songs. I know it, but you can imagine how inspiring it was for me makers of the position of the works and the use of the but since we go to serious like that, this around using this outlets that we maybe not recognize as an agency. This is foundation will let for represent that makes it more it's feel of love and 4 miles from you, 5 miles from you. The central group of computers, which will build very quickly after that. The room and the site is process of things and it's things. It might have been that the current program do I don't know what we know about that thing might have an underlying. The century, by we saw 4 miles from here, and there it was 2008, the main outcome on the octagonal land, really is weird, but still, I go to church sometimes, and there are people but octagonal land is different, take out of the countryside. I think the same thing happens. This is the typical of basically it is of some of this being around the country. Blood control, John Paul II, and the question of this it's serious part. People seriously buying China. I must say, I am a China driver. It's not happening, but okay, so this light, it might look like the illustration, but this is art that is in action, that is has true agency. I would say it's so to wrap this up, I think what it means for art movement. provide for the that you and basically the implementation. The program of the company of the resilience regarding the decision purposes of quite a long time. On the macro mundane level, for example, the stickers or the bars of streetcar is very active in that. Flash, the fashion, racing and far race, and the street corners and cities, Europe, in the West, you see that's the biggest value. That. We now just do the weeks, and it's really about explaining this how American and media and TikTok civilization. So we both will be there. They will not be very I think the past is a agent. So there will be a new steps, maybe to be somehow resisted to these steps. That was not counted. Right? We could show the value of our ideologies and hate obvious. I'm finishing on a hopeful note. I think because how it is, the government that they can be really close. And although there's still been problems that are made by really surpassing our class, I'm sure there's someone stating a unconscious figure or the people. I really love it. I can't. That's it. Giving you answers that
I told you why it's going to be. Okay, you have any questions, comments?
To talk about later. Yeah. So just on your last point, late in his life, I had a chance to interview the Polish filmmaker, Krzysztof Kieślowski, and he was talking about exactly your last point. But and it gets me to a question for you. He was talking about how censorship, he found it hard to work under consumer capitalism than under the Polish authoritarian government because he thought censorship is a slalom course. And he said you could always be one step ahead of it through craft. They would set down a gate, fly around it, they set down another gate. I guess I'd say my question is I think I'm not the only one in the room. So maybe question here, things like, oh, imagine your own book being burned. There's a certain enchantment. It means your books matter if they're burned, right? And I think in late capitalism, post-Gutenbergian age, whatever we're in now, just that a lot of art is in a consumer culture is just, you put it out there and people are like, yeah, whatever. And I just wonder about that, like what you make of that in terms of
Thank you. That's the question I was yes, one. The way censorship this also was beneficial, of a quite generous sponsorship of the state, and filmmaking, etc. So it can also double in terms of how what's the new whether that is not the case. I would say they obviously have volume and impact on the health of books, digital thinking and impact. And I think it's very complaints for the market where there's euro in some of the euro. Looking at, for example, protest or Chinese to use something on the web, for example. I mean, it's difficult, like art, it's a pain, they still manage somehow, they still manage to make poses. We wrote around last lockdown. And in that sense, I was very categorize or organize activities on the liberal context as a one it works. I would hope that it's not objective, so there are things for might be happy with the leadership. First, I don't even look at them for so nevertheless, we have just one leader, two leaders, I guess all the things also we did probably what is what is we want to do every day is some things that people just go to makes sense. You know where you have the easy.
So I guess it by it's art becoming disenchanted. I guess that's sort of the
I don't know. I was just say especially now, and I would say even now, I think it's still because emotions. Now, I think it's important. So I'm absolutely I don't know. My sound is but I feel that it's honest to learn looks. It means that they need something. And I was thinking about Florida. Thank you. We've got another question here. No comment?
It's very hot. I guess this is a little bit related to the last question, but before coming to Poland, I read this text by the Polish curator Hugo Schrader about some of the different public institutions that had right-wing directors appointed to them in Poland, including Zaczeta and others in Warsaw and Łódź. And I use that as an itinerary for what institutions I would visit, just to see what they were exhibiting. And the good news, for anyone who's wondering, is that all the right-wing art was really bad. But the part that in some ways was more confusing than looking at the bad right-wing art was that it also coexisted with other trajectories of exhibition practice. So for instance, there were permanent collections that were still on view in Łódź. There was the traveling exhibition of a Polish Roma artist from the Venice Biennial that was at Zaczeta. There were these things that were co-presented or co-programmed alongside the right-wing art, either because they had preceded the appointment of the right-wing director or various other explanations. I'm sure I can't understand as an outsider, but it made me wonder a lot about the kind of, it was a confusing experience to move between these galleries and navigate this really sort of disparate and wide range of ideological manifestations, not to mention aesthetic ones, right? And I guess I'm just wondering if you could reflect a little bit on this moment where it's not like you go to an institution and it's purely a right-wing art museum or it's purely a left-wing art museum, right? But you go from gallery to gallery and you have to actually navigate these, these quite divergent aesthetics and ideologies. And you could just talk a little bit about that as like maybe this moment in time.
Thank you. My intuitive reaction would be it's a question of space in galleries. As you said, I mean, somebody civilized process of that museum or gallery of those space. Yes, it's quite how to use it to designate that it's a base of things can be said that otherwise and there's one thing that obviously it's about the overall stability that the current people who run the states and the families of the environment can have the motivation to error not this everyone. These are I would say there's a personal connection there. There is that sense that okay, it's normalized these things, some of these things. I don't know this history. I mean, I knew my voice out with my inspiration from jail. I mentioned. I would say yes, about I mean that whole throwing is my case. At the same time, I'm back. Let's see the same side. It's one of the style. Was a lot of money was spent. It generated a buzz. It generated low options also in courts. And of course, it's and it also took very deeply about love and all these things that people associate. Much of thinking about history. So I think beyond the sentence that we do, I would not do question. Like there's that maybe there are really more explicit and they are not exhibited. There are as far as I know, Danish that was it has it's far as I've never seen that most I guess it's one aspect of the mainstream of the farm. Minimizing some of the system ideologies, I think the dangerous one, and this all kinds.
Okay, the very last, okay, but not too long. Because we are trying to stick to the schedule, but please, yes, please.
Which is making the comment that although through the directors of these meetings have been currently replaced with right-wing ideologues, a lot of the security haven't. And they are trying to work at the moment on the surface, basically kind of framing things in one way for their vector, but really continuing to program the way that they want to. And for example, my friends who are in here and this collective doing the social work about the weather like using independent inches and all globe on a residency at the moment and CPW. And basically the director doesn't really understand what their work is because they've not been properly informed. And so I think part of what we could do is to extend solidarity to these curators who are still trying to operate within these frameworks in more subversive ways, and to try and give them international opportunities to curate the things that they want to curate, for example, or to speak about the difficulty working within this context. They don't want to abandon the field, and yet they're now working in the increasing pressure.
Yes, that's a very curators are, and yet that's very the excellent outwards in having funding sources.
Thank you very much.